Tekin ekranlarından herkese selamlar. Bugün yanımızda Lea Schönfelder var ve kendisiyle oyunlar ve aktivizm konuları hakkında konuşacağız. Ve bu videoya da İngilizce devam edeceğiz. Lea Schönfelder is a game designer, producer and co-founder of Fein Games. She started her career in Flare Games and then she transferred to Us2 Games, where she worked for Monument Valley 2 and when she won a BAFTA award for that. And then she continued in Us2 Games as a lead game designer. Afterwards, she worked in Nereal as a production manager and now she's working as the co-founder of Fein Games. So welcome Lea, thank you so much for coming to our channel. I think it will be a great chat and it will be great for our audience. So would you tell a little bit about yourself to us? I introduced you as well, but we would like to learn about your personal experience and your education and how did you came to this sector in general?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. My name is Lea, and I started working in games more than 10 years ago. My background is in art, so I went to art school and almost accidentally ended up in games. But it's a great medium, and I don't want to leave it. There's great opportunities and innovation going on, especially on the cultural side. And I'm looking forward to talk about it today.
All right, so I'm gonna start with the first question. So yeah, when I read about you, you indicate that your inspiration for game design was started after you saw your brother's works with homeless people in Russia. So coming from this point, how do you think games and video games in general can boost the concept of activism, which you work about more, and how this can be accomplished?
Yeah, so you're right. The motivation for my very first game was the personal experience I had while I visited my brother in Russia, and he was telling me about the life that street children were having who he worked with. And I think what's special about my approach to game design, if I may say so, is that I used to start games from a very personal perspective. And in my early career, I was an independent designer, where obviously that was kind of natural. And there is many independent game designers who do similar things, who are, like you say, activists of a sort, or artists, or however you want to call it. But even later on, when I started going into the industry, I tried to put something personal and something meaningful to me and hopefully others into the games that I work for.
So when we look at your perspective towards game, more than focusing on money-making games or games that would attract the most audience, you have a more idealistic perspective, trying to influence people and try to have an impact on the world we live in, if I'm right.
I think that was my approach very early on. I mean, as I said, I was starting out as an independent game designer and coming from art school. Maybe I had this more kind of artistic attitude of, oh yeah, I can be like to a degree not understandable. I just want to express myself. I must say that in the meantime, I have moved away from this attitude a little bit. So by now I do actually have the goal to be both meaningful and accessible. So I take a lot of care, or at Fein Games, we take a lot of care to make games that can actually be understood. So we make games for women, by women, which means that we start testing from day one, practically with our target audience. And I think it has both sides. It is the idealistic side, of course, that we want players to enjoy the games, and especially people who may not be as game literate, which adult women sometimes aren't. To give them an opportunity to enjoy our games and not make them super challenging. And obviously the other side is true as well, that as a business owner, I have to make sure that we get enough cash into our bank at the end of the month to pay our people.
Yeah, I believe actually it's very valuable what you're doing is because when we look at the industry these days, most of the games are solely based on spending time and not getting anything back from the game they are working on. But you say you moved on, yeah, but do you think it was hard in the beginning when you started this business, this industry, when you entered the industry, to survive and to thrive, to improve yourself with this perspective towards games? And what were these hardships?
Yes, definitely. I started my first job, I think it was 10 years ago, roughly at Fein Games, which was a really nice employer. Actually, the founder of Fein Games is one of our investors now. But I did feel culturally quite unaligned in the beginning. So as I said, I come from art school and then entering a world which is very nerdy, very male, very like there is a certain culture which I just didn't have. I never played much games when I was young. I literally just stumbled upon it at university. So I think the biggest challenge was that at the beginning, I didn't feel I fit in. I didn't know all the famous games. I didn't play games since I was 4 years old with my dad on the lab, which is like one common story that a lot of designers would tell you. Yeah, and I did feel sometimes that I was lacking something, like a certain skill as a game designer. And it wasn't until Us2Games, which was my next employer, where I actually understood, okay, this is not a lack of something, but it's actually a richness that I bring and others brought as well, which is some perspective that comes outside from games. And Us2Games is a very open and very progressive studio that understood that and that valued cultural influences that came from the arts, from pop culture, from music, from dance. Like they were very, very open to get inspirations. I mean, they originated from a design studio and created this wonderful game that used to be my favorite game, Monument Valley. So I was super thrilled to be working on the sequel of it, on Monument Valley 2, as a senior designer.
That must be great, designing the sequel of your favorite game later on. Also, what I think is, since you mentioned the cultural side and your different background, I think it's also valuable in order to bring a different audience to the gaming industry. Because when we look at it, it's the gamers are mostly the teenagers and people who love playing games since their childhood. But when we look at your games, for example, The Perfect Woman, you're able to bring a different audience who do not really play games and who hasn't played it before, but at the same time they're interested in the topic and the cultural influence of the game, so that they enter this sector and then they start playing your game, and then maybe they become interested in other games you make, or they see other games. And I think it's very valuable to bring different I'm not going to say classes, but communities to this sector. So another question I want to ask is, since you're very sensitive and into these discrepancies, showing discrepancies in the society, discrimination, and your idea of what's wrong, so I wanted to ask if you observed, and which observations you make. How did you observe discrimination and discrepancies in the industry itself, in game design industry, and in the game designing industry in general?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I must say in advance that I personally feel very lucky that most of my employers have been pretty encouraging. I always had people who would push me. So I personally probably didn't experience the worst of it. I did experience some, and I think if you look at the media, obviously there are all these stories about sexual assault, really bad things, sexism, gender pay gap, all of these which are really bad stories. But I want to maybe bring attention to the little things that are more subtle and therefore more even harder to see that there is a problem, rather than, I mean, if somebody sexually assaults you, that's just a crime, right? So that's pretty easy to say that that's wrong. I think where my experience lies is a much more subtler. So, for example, at Us2Games, I mean, I said it before how much I love this employer, so that's really not. I really don't want to say bad things about them. But I think what is normal in a society where men are usually in the position of power, it was for me as a lead designer, which I became after Monument Valley 2 on the next project. So I was lead designer on Assemble with Care. Again, thank you. So that was a big opportunity. And that was an example where they pushed me. That then when I was there were a lot of instances where I had to fight for what I felt might have been the more female choice of things, or maybe the softer, the more artistic choice of things. And it was very much questioned. So I remember in the early days, we had discussions about the concept, and Assemble with Care is a really chill game. There is no timer, you're not under stress, you're just preparing little objects and listen to a story. And I wanted it to be like this. I wanted it to be almost meditative. And I remember in the early days, the pushback was pretty big, and it was always questions like, oh yeah, but where is the existential crisis? Where is the problem? Where is, like, shouldn't we introduce some thunderstorm and the protagonist would like almost be killed on the beach? I remember those discussions. And I think that was one of the reasons that I felt I always had to fight for those micro choices, that I thought of founding my own studio, just in order to not have those debates as much anymore.
So you say that even though we see so many more serious things, but you haven't encountered those situations personally, but still there's a passive aggressive attitude in the gaming industry towards women working in there, towards female game designers, and it still goes on.
Yes, I think so. I think, well, it is like with society, right? So you see progress and you don't see progress. I think we shouldn't forget the positive sides as well. Like a lot of the games, folks are aware of problems we have. They are not solved yet, but being aware of them is kind of a first step, right? I think what we still need to address more forcefully, and I think not enough effort has been done there, is that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, there are many studios who brag themselves as, oh yeah, we are 50% female now, for example. But if you look closer, it's like the lowest paying jobs are women or people from ethnic minorities, and then the further up you go, the more white and the more male it gets. So there is definitely a lot of problems there, and this is then obviously also reflected in the gender pay gap, which we are trying to close, for example, by discipline agnostic pay. So it is widely common to pay programmers much more than, for example, artists, and accidentally or not, programmers are more often men than artists. So there are these types of, I would call them structural discriminations a lot still. And yeah, I fear that we have to fight the battle for years, if not decades. And I really appeal to everybody in power to do something more than just saying, oh yeah, we need more diversity and inclusion, but actually like put your money where your mouth is, really, because in the end it will cost you money in the first, and then afterwards, I mean, there have been a lot of studies that teams that are diverse are actually more effective or come up with better ideas, so eventually it will pay off.
All right, thank you. Also, when you said fighting, we also see in your games, in Finding Hannah, in the Perfect Woman, that you try to show the effort of mostly women to fit into the society and the construct that was made. So coming from this point, what was the driving force for you to design the Perfect Woman? Because when we look, it's a very different game than the rest of the games that are available in the gaming industry, and it was published by Xbox, what we will talk about later. But like, what made you think that I should design a game like the Perfect Woman, and it should be on Xbox and people should be able to play it through their body movements? And what did you want them to think about when they played the game?
Yeah, good question. I think my motivation for this project was curiosity mostly. It was one of my earlier games, so I was still like trying to push the medium, seeing what's possible technically as well. It was it's a game for the Kinect, and you can actually still play it in some museums. So it works really well in a like exhibition context. It's not so much something that you play alone at home. And what has always fascinated me about games, and still does, is how well systems lend themselves to telling a story. During my study, I studied illustration and animation, and usually you still tell stories in a very linear way. And what I always loved about games, and my brain really loves, is those systems that, can form an artistic thought and communicate it and then make people laugh. And Perfect Woman is quite ironic as well. So the game works. You always have choices, right? You start at age 4, I think, and then you are 13, then you're 26, then you're 50, so on and so on. And you also always have choices in your life, but your previous choices determine how easy it will be to become the next thing. So, for example, if you studied very hard, it will be easy for you to become the foreign minister, but if you did some other things in your youth, you become a prostitute, for example, at the age of 60. So all of these choices are always possible, but they are more or less harder depending on your past. And Perfect Woman is actually ironic in that way. So you have to dance those scenarios, and the performances are more or less difficult. And well, the title of the game prompts you towards being a perfect woman, but actually if you try to do that, it will be almost impossible, because it requires you to have this like really laissez-faire youth, and then have children at the age of 26, then be a successful professor at 40, and then, I don't know, have your career done at 50 or something like that, which obviously is super hard, and that's what the game is commenting on. Yeah.
So I think that commenting is very valuable, because when we look at the industry right now and the games we can buy anywhere, we don't really see this effort to say something, to make the audience realize something and have a storytelling that's meaningful. That's what we can call as an activist game designing strategy. So coming from this point, we see that you published it through Xbox, and when we look at Xbox other games, they don't really care about these giving messages side of the games, but rather they only care about the money making side. So like I call this as hacking Xbox. So like, how was the process of publishing this game and convincing Xbox for the publication regarding their policies, ongoing policies?
I mean, the game came out on Xbox, but essentially every game that makes it through the review process, you can publish. So it isn't exactly that they chose our game and gave us money. That wasn't the case, but we followed the rules and submitted the game, and then there are certain requirements. I don't know, there is a certain way you have to be able to load the game or have achievements, stuff like that you have to implement, but it's more technical. It's not really a question. They are not really we weren't in a curative system. I guess the only thing that we had to be careful around is because sometimes my games are explicit, so they show nudity, and their platforms will be quite careful, especially later on, for example, with the Apple platform. I remember from one game we had to take out all the cigarettes, for example, because it wasn't, we couldn't publish it as a, I don't know, children's game anymore.
Yeah, like, and also as I know, and as you said, the Perfect Woman was started to be designed as plus 18, right? And what were the initial intentions for this for this idea, and also what was the feedback you received? Because it's a very unorthodox way to design a game, I think.
Are you talking about, so Perfect Woman is this dancing game. I made another game which is actually a sex game where you play as a woman who has to sleep with as many men as she can before getting married. And I think the way to do that is, basically you have to forget about like all the standard ways to promote your game or earn money. So these titles were really mainly experiments, and Ute, for example, was completely free as well. So you could just play it on the web. I think it doesn't exist anymore because it was a Flash game, but you can still watch videos about it. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think actually there should be more games like that, more games that explore adult content, not in a pornographic way, but in an artistic way. And I think it's being made very hard through like all these big platforms that obviously want to speak to as large of an audience as possible. So yeah, I think in a world where you're always trying to please everyone, those topics are kind of less and less attractive to really pursue.
And I think that's what causes lesser quality games and lesser artistic games, because as they try to reach out to a wider audience, they have to cut things. And as you said, I think it was a very preventive measure from widening your audience when you make a plus 18 games. And was it, do you think there are some suppressive factors and some certain legislative processes, or like processes in terms of the game publishers, that prevents publishing these plus 18 games? And like, what were the also things you encountered that discouraged you in this process of publishing a my plus 18 game?
Yeah, I mean, it's the platforms in the end, right? Platforms like when you make mobile games, you have to publish through Apple, and they have rules. For example, like on the App Store, I think you can't even show naked thighs. So someone in very short shorts, you can't show stomachs and stuff. So yeah, and they have a big power over you. It might be a little bit different on Steam, or maybe the usual demographic is a little bit older. But if you go into something that's supposed to be family friendly, I mean, in a way, it also makes sense, right? Because they want to protect their audience. But I just wish that there were other spaces where you can make something, yeah, a bit more niche, a bit more nuanced, and a bit different from the mainstream.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Your fame, and you are more renowned after you earned a BAFTA award, and your fame definitely increased, and people started to research more about you. So like, and after that, we saw that there's this new idea of making games that would influence people, that would cause an aspiration in certain people. And I think that you are one of the people who would accomplish this. So do you have the goal of creating a new genre, or like creating a niche game type that would try to influence people and make them think about what they are doing and some of the problems they are facing in the world, but they're not really aware of? And do you think this would lead to a new way of game designing that would put activism and making people think in the center, rather than a basic and just flowing storytelling?
Well, thank you for the flowers. I would wish to be that person. There are actually really smart people, like especially in the US, for example, Rila Khaled or Paolo Pedercini, who are very activist in what they are doing, and also for a much longer time already that I've been doing it. I think like you asked me personally, right? And I think for me, it is one step at a time. I have started out with this more activist and provocative approach, and I'm still enjoying it in a sense of we're very public, like even with Fein Games, we are very open about our culture. We get great press in mainstream media, for example, in big women's magazines. We were in the Vogue, for example, where they are happy to talk about feminism in games now, which is great. All of this is great achievements. But as a studio, I think the big challenge we face right now, that we, like, even if we don't want to submit to a capitalist system in order to be sustainable, we have to generate some kind of revenue, right? And in the position where we are at right now, I think for a few years at least, we have to go that route of maybe a bit more subtle changing or turning people's heads. Like one thing, for example, I think something really beautiful that has happened with Finding Hannah now, and it wasn't even planned like this, but So Finding Hannah is our latest games, and it tells a story about a Berlin woman in a midlife crisis. And because two of our staff were queer and the writer was one of them, it became a queer story without us even intending to make a queer story. It just so happened that the main character was gay, right? And we published the game and we didn't think about it that much. We think, okay, this is a game for women, right? And then suddenly the whole queer community picked it up. And yeah, now press is talking about it as well. And I think this is more the form of success that we're looking after right now. This kind of softer, more like less fighting against something, but fighting for something, if that makes sense. Because of this thought, okay, all of this has to make sense in a business way. Okay, having said that, I would love to at some point be in the position where it's really the case. I mean, you're kind of describing it as if it were already, but it's not quite yet. So I would love to be in the position where people just take whatever game I make from me, and it can be radical again, and it can be subversive and again, and all those things. So yeah, that's very much my life goal, but let's see all the little steps that it needs in between.
Yeah, in this context, I also think that it was books before us in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. But when we come to the 21st century, our context of communication changed, all the technology and everything. So people are searching for new things to convey their ideas and everything. So, and I believe that it's now the games, and specifically video games, and I think it will be the main tool of inspiring teenagers or teaching people things, or making people aware of the ongoing problems they are facing. And as you said, it's your main goal in life. It's very valuable in terms of being an open platform, because no matter what ideology you choose, left, right, the middle, you are able to express your feelings. And I think the canceling culture and the feedback is not as strict and reckless as it is in the media sector, in the gaming sector. So I think it's a more of a free sector that you can tell whatever you want. So would you agree with that, or do you think there are also pretty much many restrictions about what you can publish if you have radical or even non-radical ideas?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What I love about games is that still so much is possible, and I feel that it is a rather free medium. I mean, it is not free from all the feedback that you are describing, and there are shitstorms and there is fandom. Like, I see those almost as two sides of the same coin, right? So I don't even know if I want to miss it that much, unless, I mean, of course, I want to miss all the haters that you get if you do something a little bit out of the box. So one thing that is important for me, and I think sometimes it's misunderstood, there is this idea that some independent designers have, or maybe some game designers as well, when they talk about like activist games, which is that they want to change people for the better. And it's not exactly that what I want. Because for me, this approach has some underlying hubris to it, something like, I know better how the world works than you, and therefore I'm telling you with my game now how you should think. And I think sometimes that is good and necessary, and sometimes education can happen through that, and sometimes, I don't know, maybe you might learn about climate change through some systemic game, for example. All of that would be great, but what interests me more is to ask questions and then really sparking a debate. So for example, when I was talking about Perfect Woman before, I was saying that the game kind of punishes you if you want to be perfect, because it's obviously very hard. So one of the feedback I got, especially from feminists, and it was supposed to be a feminist game, yeah, what are you saying? Are you saying that women shouldn't have it all? And why can men have it all? Shouldn't we also be able to have it all? And I find this really valid and a good comment. And I don't have an answer to it, right? I think both is true. I think we should be able to have everything. I also think, and this is probably true for men and women, it's very hard to have everything. everything. And maybe it shouldn't be our goal in life. But this kind of unsolvable questions that motivate people to engage in some way and think about it in some way is much more interesting to me than changing somebody's mind to think the right thing.
Yeah, I agree. And also, what I want to ask is, in this, in terms of your perspective towards games, you, let's say, in terms of activism towards game, do you think there are some game design components that are more useful than the others to make the audience realize something, make the audience feel something? So you say that you're able to have choices in the perfect woman, and it leads to a result, and it's like an RPG, MMORPG element. But do you think there are some other components or some small details or major things that helps you to accomplish what you want, and mostly activism in game design?
I think that is the beauty of games for me, that it can be so many things that there is not this one answer towards this question. I mean, every game consists of graphics, animation at least, and some form of input, right? Then most of the time you have sound. Sometimes, depending on the device you're playing on, you have movement as well. Like, there are so many things going into it and so many interactions that you can design out of it. And I think that is the interesting thing for people to come up with it. But eventually so first of all, I would say each individual discipline you can convey your thoughts with. I mean, you can convey it through writing, through art, through sound, through interaction and design. But then also there is this way of doing it using everything. And one really powerful mode, I think, is humor. So if you get your players to laugh, I think you're actually doing something right, because they will engage with your game, and I think the brain is more open when you laugh, right, for new thoughts. So that would be my goal.
Definitely, I would argue that making the audience laugh makes them also vulnerable, and they would listen to you further. So also, throughout your adventures in the gaming industry, what coming from experience, what would you recommend aspiring game designers, and especially the people who has ideas to tell, to do? Should they do? Should they go to a school with a game designing department? Should they go to a school and study literature? Or what path should they follow? Or is there no path and there's always a unique way? But also, what would you recommend for individuals with the goals of doing the things like you are doing right now?
Yeah, I think the most important advice I would have would be try to make a game as far as you get. I mean, it can start as a physical prototype. It can even start as a concept, like writing it down. But then there is a lot of tools online on Udemy, for example. There are classes that teach you programming, games programming in particular. I really encourage you to look out for game design studies, which is popping up more and more now. When I was young, it was mostly private schools that would do it, but now there are public schools as well everywhere. So I can definitely recommend it. But I mean, most importantly, do what is interesting to you, right? And if you're interested in music, then study music and go into the games industry after. If you're interested in art, then study art and go into the game industry after. A variety of things you can do. And yeah, it's a really nice place to be.
So in this case, in the activism side of the games, do you think it's more important to be a good storyteller than being a good game designer? Okay, it goes together as well, but like, do you think it's also more important to have the literal side, looking at the games, have the artistic sides, and have the, most importantly, the desire to tell something? Or do you think it's also easy to accomplish this by just being a great game designer?
Well, I think great game designers also are very good storytellers. There is a lot of different ways you can do game design, but I think after all, we all want to create big experiences, and big experiences obviously consist of the game loop that have to be engaging and you want to replay over and over again. But as a whole, you have to tell a story and you have to take the player onto a journey. They have to start somewhere. They have to go through up and downs, and they have to finish somewhere. So I think dramaturgy is something that a good game designer should definitely bring, or at least if they don't bring it themselves, then work in a team where someone else has these skills.
So also, you are now publishing your latest game on Steam, Finding Hannah. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it was made? What was the initial ideas and how it came out and all the process?
Yeah, sure. So I'm really proud that Finding Hannah came out now. It's our debut of my own studio, which I co-founded with Franziska Zeiner. And our first title tells the story of three women living in different decades in Berlin. So it has this historic aspect to it. Hannah is in her late 30s and she's clubbing and has a good job. And superficially, she has everything she needs. But she's not happy, and she's going through a midlife crisis, if you want so. And then she starts talking to her mother and grandmother, who lived in different times and had different struggles. So her mother, Sigrid, lived in the wild 70s, and she was an activist and was always protesting and away and not really caring about her daughter that much, while her grandmother grew up in the 1930s, 1940s, which was, of course, a time of Nazi Germany. And she was one of the Mitläufer, one of the people who let everything happen. So, but she was always very nice with Hannah. And there is this conflict as well in German history, of course, of, okay, individually you love these people, but they have this historic guilt. This is kind of the story that the whole thing is about. And gameplay-wise, it's a hidden object game, and we decided to do that because we wanted to, let the Berlin of the different decades come to life. So you have some nice scenes set in the now time, but also scenes from the 70s, scenes from the 40s, and we have a really super talented artist, Elena Resco, who draws all these things. And I'm quite excited for what came out of it. And if you're interested, you can look it up on the app stores on mobile. And it's also coming to Steam. And we're happy about Wishlist.
Yeah, we'll definitely provide a link for all these games, and we'll be putting all the gameplay videos. And I watched a lot of gameplay of Finding Hannah, and it looks very interesting. And the idea of showing Berlin in different historical eras through a finding game is, I think, very unique, because you have to spend time looking at the screen and you have to detect certain objects put on the screen, and at the same time you're exposed to those historical things, and meanwhile you have the time to think as well, I think, because I believe one of the problems with modern games is that they are so fast and you're doing something all the time that you do not really have time to stop and think and criticize what you're doing and what you're playing, but rather it just flows like that. All right, thank you so much, Lea. It was such a great talk with you, and I think it will be very great for our Turkish audience to be exposed to a different talk like this, and we're very happy to have you as our guest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I will now end it in Turkish as well. Yeah. Sevgili makine izleyicileri, izlediğiniz için çok teşekkürler. Bugün Lea Schönfelder bizle beraberdi. Kendisinin oyunlarına aşağıdaki linklerden de ulaşabilirsiniz. Tekrardan teşekkürler. Görüşmek üzere. Hoşçakalın.